In the Club Random podcast, Bill Maher and Richard Dreyfuss discussed their past collaboration on a show about the Constitution. Maher recalls being a young comic and being approached by Dreyfuss, who was a big movie star at the time and wanted to do a show celebrating the anniversary of the Constitution. Dreyfuss carried the opening of the show for the first 15 minutes, along with Jeff Tambor, but Maher does not remember much else about it. The conversation then takes a turn as Dreyfuss explains that he was once owed hundreds of thousands of dollars by Disney for the 11 films he did for them, which led him to sue the company. Maher highlights the common occurrence of having to sue studios in Hollywood to get paid for work. They also discuss Maher's firing from ABC by Disney in 2001 and the corporate feuds he had with various heads in the industry. The discussion then moves to the #MeToo movement, which both Maher and Dreyfuss agree became deadly serious very quickly. Maher compares the movement to solving a crime in movies where they start with low-level criminals and work their way up to big fish like Harvey Weinstein. The conversation highlights the seriousness of issues in the entertainment industry and the importance of addressing them, despite the industry being primarily focused on entertainment. They then begin discussing the concept of misinformation and the importance of seeking out reliable sources of information. Maher brings up the idea of command rumors, which are rumors that circulate and are accepted as truth simply because they are repeated frequently enough. Dreyfuss adds to this idea by stating that people often have a tendency to believe things that confirm what they already believe, even if those things are not actually true. Dreyfuss explains the consequences of misinformation, stating that it's dangerous, it's undermining our democracy, it's creating a situation where people can't rely on information. He emphasizes the importance of finding reliable sources of information and urges people to take responsibility for educating themselves on important issues. He warns against blindly accepting information from unverified sources, saying, "You can't really rely on social media the way you used to rely on newspapers or TV news." To emphasize the dangers of misinformation, Dreyfuss uses the example of the QAnon conspiracy theory, calling it a shameful moment in our history. He explains that the spread of the conspiracy theory has resulted in serious consequences, such as when a man opened fire at a Washington, D.C. pizzeria based on false allegations made by believers in the conspiracy theory. Richard Dreyfuss discusses the Harvey Weinstein scandal and how he was one of the prominent figures who dated beautiful women and got away with it. Dreyfuss knew Cosby personally and comments on how it is surprising that he was able to get away with his actions not just for years but for decades. Though Dreyfuss mentions that the women who were involved were not necessarily innocent bystanders, as it was part of the dating culture of the time in Hollywood in the 60s and 70s. Furthermore, Dreyfuss brings up the role of the mafia wives who would turn a blind eye to their partner's actions. He emphasizes that people who witnessed the actions didn't say or do anything about it, and this was simply ignored by Hollywood as a whole. Finally, even though he admits to having participated in Quaalude use, he emphasizes that he was not present for the Hollywood scene during the 60s and 70s. Richard Dreyfuss, the guest on the Club Random podcast, talks about his journey as an actor. He mentions that he did 11 films and was usually portrayed as someone who was messed up in some way or the other. He also talks about the way he used to keep his apartment, indicating that he was quite messy. However, his wife, who is a neat freak, helps him keep his things organized. Dreyfuss speaks about his early days in Hollywood, where he was invited to the Playboy Mansion but wasn't a star yet. He talks about how he struggled and how he made it big after Jaws, which was released in 1975. His role in the movie became iconic, and people still remember his dialogue, "Check all the cops and tell them to come and get me." Later on in the conversation, the topic of masturbation arises, and Dreyfuss goes on to reveal his thoughts on incestuous thoughts that drove his masturbation. He explains how in the early years he thought about his sister and wife more than anyone else. The host then mentions the prevalence of incest porn, which prompts Dreyfuss to talk about how porn stars in another era could have easily been movie stars. However, they were held back due to their involvement in the porn industry, where they were always subjected to being treated poorly, like taking jizz on their face. This leads the conversation to the scandals of the past, specifically the times when people in the industry got away with the same or worse as people like Bill Cosby and Louis B. Mayer. Dreyfuss supports this by mentioning Shirley Temple's book, which hints at the ongoing scandalous misdeeds towards her. They also discuss how Hollywood was invented by Jews and how they catered to a Protestant America to feed back the Protestant dream. Dreyfuss talks about how Hollywood didn't show America the struggles they had when they came from Russia. Instead, they portrayed themselves in this new and better place where they weren't being chased by Cossacks. They also talked about the infamous Chochinsky riots, which were a decade-long anti-Jewish pogrom in Russia, and how it led to the Jews fleeing Russia for a new and better life. Marilyn Monroe's biopic movie was discussed as well, and Dreyfuss praised Anna Diamish's performance. He also talked about the mistreatment Marilyn had received from the men in her life. They also talk about their TV habits before bed, and Dreyfuss expresses his dislike for disturbing content that could affect his sleep. He recalls a scene from a movie in which Marilyn Monroe is shown servicing President John F. Kennedy. Dreyfuss finds the scene disturbing and questions whether Kennedy was really that bad. He talks about how the scene was shot to move the viewers and shares his reaction to it. Maher questions Dreyfuss's claim of not realizing his stardom after starring in the blockbuster movie Jaws in 1975. Dreyfuss explains how one can remain oblivious to their own stardom by recounting instances where people tiptoe around them and only become excited or vocal after they have passed. He also talks about how he seldom reads reviews or praises of his work. Another talking point was about Cary Grant, where they talked about how Diane Cannon, Cary Grant's former wife, said that he would read his old reviews lying down on the living room floor. They also discussed how Cary Grant wrote on the cover of his memoirs, "Everyone wanted to be Cary Grant, even I wanted to be Cary Grant," to which Richard Dreyfuss commented that it's just what a girl would say, and it doesn't make it true. The conversation then shifted to a different topic where they talked about the movie The Last of Sheila, which was written by Stephen Sondheim and released in 1974. Richard Dreyfuss recommended the movie, and they discussed how it was the first movie that showed the same scene from different points of view, which became the template for crime thrillers later on. They also discussed how James Mason starred in the movie and shared a story about how he met James Mason when he went to London to attend the Royal Command performance of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. At the event, Richard Dreyfuss was told about the dress code, and the staff of the hotel in London took his measurements and sent them off to a tailor. He also mentioned that there were strict protocols to follow when meeting the Queen. He explains that he was told that only those whose names were on the invitation were allowed to meet the Queen, and that he was instructed not to speak unless spoken to first. Dreyfuss's girlfriend at the time was not named on the invitation, but he decided to bring her along as his plus one. This caused some issues with her, as she was not named in the invitation and was not supposed to meet the Queen. Maher jokingly suggests that the ex-girlfriend was ungrateful for being invited to meet the Queen. Dreyfuss mentions that his ex-girlfriend's father forced her to break up with him because he was Jewish. The conversation also turns to the topic of maturity and how men and women mature at different speeds, with Maher suggesting that men are barely mature at 37, whereas women can be very mature at 20. Dreyfuss agrees and adds that people are not just numbers, but humans with complex emotions and experiences. The conversation then takes a turn into the topic of betrayal and how it starts with childhood experiences. Dreyfuss mentions that boys lie like crazy and that girls talk to their pack, who tell them how to respond to betrayals. Maher adds that these experiences can be painful and difficult to deal with. Maher and Dreyfuss both agree that boys communicate about sexual problems through cartoon vocabulary, while girls talk about it in more technical terms. Dreyfuss argues that girls are exposed to sexual content at a young age, possibly as early as age 8, due to the prevalence of explicit content on the internet and social media. Dreyfuss reflects on his own upbringing, saying he was grateful for his very innocent upbringing in suburban New Jersey in the 1960s, which was free from drug issues, divorce, and racial issues. They also discussed the awkwardness of puberty, with Dreyfuss admitting that he didn't know what he was doing when he first started masturbating, but was more focused on the pleasure it brought. Maher adds that girls are more open with each other about sex compared to boys, but Dreyfuss objects to this, saying that he doesn't know many women who are mechanical engineers when it comes to discussing sex. The conversation then turns to parenting, with Maher saying that kids have become intolerable due to a lack of parental control. He argues that kids are like the Lord of the Flies and that parents need to civilize them. Dreyfuss jokes that kids are horrible and that he receives high fives from people for not having kids. However, both Maher and Dreyfuss agree that there is still an impulse to both kiss and punish their kids when they misbehave. Dreyfuss briefly mentions that being a parent is like having a monster for 10 years, but ultimately it's worth it in the end. They then transition into discussing Dreyfuss's movies, and Maher praises him for his contribution to entertainment, noting that Dreyfuss's movies were smart and entertaining. They discuss how at a certain age kids may not appreciate the entertaining aspect of movies, but Dreyfuss mentions that he could have been in the movie Jaws, but turned it down twice. Maher calls this dumb, and Dreyfuss explains that he was eventually picked for his role in the movie because he reminded Steven Spielberg of himself. Additionally, they briefly talk about Spielberg's recent movie Fabelmans and how it speaks to the current issue of anti-Semitism. Dreyfuss also mentions that he has a book that represents 6 years of a 50-year obsession where he figured out the biggest problem America faced. However, he doesn't reveal the details of the problem during the conversation. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of The Pod Slice.